the massive glass structure that had protected New Haven's 3,000 survivors. For 50 years groaned like a wounded beast, spiderweb fractures spreading across its crystalline surface. Outside, the woundlands stretched endlessly a savage wilderness where genetically enhanced predators ruled supreme. The environmental seals are failing, reported Marcus Chen, the dome's chief engineer, his weathered face pale with exhaustion. We have maybe 72 hours before complete atmospheric breach. Elena stared through the cracking dome at the twilight landscape beyond. Twisted metal forests grew where cities once stood, their bioluminescent leaves pulsing with alien rhythms. In the distance, she could see them shadows moving with predatory grace between the ruins. The apex hunters, created in humanity's final desperate years as weapons of war. They had outlived their makers and claimed the world as their own. 7-year-old Kira Nakamura pressed her small hand against the viewing panel, her dark eyes wide, with curiosity rather than fear. Why don't they come inside, Dr. Voss? Because they're smart enough to wait, Elena replied grimly. The child couldn't understand that they were all living on borrowed time. Commander Sarah Blake stormed into the observation deck, her military bearing unchanged despite years of peaceful dome life. We need to discuss evacuation protocols. The eastern sector is already showing signs of structural failure. Evacuate to where? Elena's voice cracked with bitter laughter. The nearest functioning dome is 2,000 kilometers away, across territory controlled by creatures that view U.S.'s extinct vermin through the dome's speakers. The haunting calls of the apex hunters echoed across the wasteland. These weren't the simple roars of Earth's original predators, these were complex vocalizations, almost musical in their intelligence. The genetically enhanced creatures possessed cognitive abilities that rivaled human intelligence, combined with physical capabilities that far exceeded anything nature had ever produced. Kira tilted her head, listening to the calls with an expression of concentrated attention. They're sad, she whispered. Sad, Marcus scoffed. They're planning our deaths, child. But Elena found herself studying the girl's face. Kira had been born inside the dome, had never known the fear that defined the older generation's relationship with the outside world. To her, the creatures beyond the glass were simply another form of life. As if summoned by their conversatio. A massive shadow moved across the dome's surface. Elena's breath caught in her throat. It was a saber-spined 12 feet of engineered perfection, with retractable bone blades along its arms and a cranial structure that housed a brain 3 times larger than any natural predator. The creature's intelligent yellow eyes surveyed the dome with calculating interest. They know, Commander Blake breathed. They know we're vulnerable. The saber spine tilted its head, studying the humans through the cracked glass. For a moment, Elena could have sworn she saw something almost like recognition. In those alien eyes, not the cold calculation of a predator, but the complex emotion of a thinking being. Then it was gone, vanishing into the bioluminescent forest with supernatural grace. 71 hours. Marcus updated grimly, watching his instruments. The dome won't last 71 hours. As night fell over the woundlands, the calls of the apex hunters grew louder, more numerous. They were gathering, Elena realized. The question was whether they came as executioners or something else. Entirely. Dr. James Morrison had spent 15 years studying the behavioral patterns of apex hunters. From the safety of Aurora Dome's research facility, his wall-mounted screens displayed decades of observational data, hunting patterns, social structures, territorial boundaries. What they revealed terrified him more than any nightmare. They're not just gathering, he explained to the emergency council, his voice trembling. They're organizing. Look at these movement patterns from the past 48 hours. The holographic display showed dozens of heat signatures converging on their location. Saber spines, thunder claws, shadow stalkers, apex predators that normally maintain strict territorial boundaries were coming together in unprecedented numbers. Maya Patel, the dome's youngest council member at 28, studied the data with clinical detachment. Could this be a natural phenomenon? Some kind of seasonal migration we haven't observed before? There are no seasons for creatures like these, Dr. Morrison replied. They were designed to be adaptable to any environment, any condition. This gathering is intentional, outside. The dome's emergency lighting cast eerie shadows across the cracking surface. Young Tommy Rodriguez pressed his face against the reinforced glass of the children's quarters, watching the shapes that moved in the darkness beyond. Unlike the adults, he felt no fear, only fascination. "Mom, why do the grown-ups say they're monsters?" he asked his mother, Rosa, who worked in the dome's hydroponic gardens. Rosa knelt beside her son, struggling to find words. "Because they were made to be weapons, Mio. Before you were born, before the dome. Humans created them to fight in wars, but the wars ended, and they stayed. But they haven't tried to hurt us," Tommy pointed out with the devastating logic of childhood. "They could break the glass if they wanted to, couldn't they?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Rosa had no answer. In the dome's central plaza, Engineer Liu Wei worked frantically to reinforce the failing support struts. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he welded emergency patches over the spreading cracks. The work was futile, everyone knew it, but the alternative was surrendering to despair. "Liu," Commander Blake's voice crackled through his comm unit. "Report to the command center immediately. We have a situation." Liu dropped his tools and ran, arriving at the command center to find the entire council gathered around the main display. What he saw made his blood freeze. A single apex hunter stood directly beneath the dome's apex, its massive form clearly visible in the harsh glare of the security lights. But this wasn't one of the familiar predator species they'd cataloged over the years. This creature was something new, or perhaps something very old, standing nearly 15 feet tall, with a serpentine neck and arms that ended in hands rather than claws. It possessed an almost humanoid intelligence in its stance. Ancient scars crisscrossed its dark hide, and when it lifted its head to look directly at the observation cameras, its eyes held an unmistakable depth of thought. "What is that thing?" Maya whispered. Dr. Morrison's face had gone pale. "That's impossible. The genetic records show no creature matching that description. Unless," Elena said slowly, "it's not from the same generation as the others. What if this is one of the prototype designs, something from the early experiments?" The creature, for lack of a better term, they began calling it the ancient, remained motionless beneath the dome. For hours, it neither threatened nor retreated, simply waited with the patience of something that had learned to measure time in decades, rather than moments. As dawn approached, other apex hunters began to emerge from the bioluminescent forest. They arranged themselves in a rough circle round the dome, maintaining perfect spacing like soldiers in formation. But they faced outward, not inward, as if protecting rather than besieging. Tommy Rodriguez was the first to notice. "Look, Mom," he whispered, pointing through the cracked glass. "They're not looking at us anymore. They're looking away." And he was right. Every single predator in the gathering had positioned itself to watch the wasteland beyond, as if standing guard against some greater threat that the humans couldn't yet perceive. Professor Amelia Cross had devoted her life to xenolinguistics, the study of non-human communication systems. In the dome's quietest corner, surrounded by audio equipment and translation matrices, she listened to something that should have been impossible. The apex hunters were talking. "These aren't random vocalizations," she announced to the gathered council, her excitement barely contained. "There's grammatical structure here, complex syntax. They're not just communicating, they're debating." The recordings played through the chamber's speakers, deep, resonant tones that seemed to carry emotional weight, punctuated by higher frequencies that might have been questions or challenges. To untrained ears, it sounded like the calls of sophisticated animals. To Amelia, it was clearly language. "What are they saying?" Elena asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "I can't translate specific words yet," Amelia admitted, "but the patterns suggest disagreement. There are at least 3 distinct voices in this recording, and they're arguing about something." Outside, the standoff continued. The ancient remained beneath the dome's peak while the other apex hunters maintained their protective perimeter. For 3 days, neither side had moved, creating a tension that stretched human nerves to their breaking point. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the dome's child psychologist, noticed something the adults had missed. The children showed no fear of the creatures beyond the glass. 8-year-old Alex Chen had begun drawing pictures of the apex hunters not as monsters, but as guardians with sad eyes and careful hands. They see something we don't, Dr. Tanaka reported to Elena. Children's perceptions aren't clouded by historical trauma. To them, these aren't the weapons that ended our world, they're just beings trying to communicate. The breakthrough came when young Kira Nakamura had what the adults initially dismissed as a tantrum. She pressed herself against the dome's inner surface, tears streaming down her face, and began making soft vocalizations that sounded almost like the recordings from Professor Cross's equipment. The ancient's head snapped up immediately, its massive eyes focusing on the small girl. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, child and creature stared at each other through the cracked barrier that separated their worlds. Then the ancient did something unprecedented. It knelt. The massive predator lowered itself until its head was level with Kira's, pressing one enormous hand against the glass where her small palm rested. The other apex hunters turned to watch, their own vocalizations falling silent. "My God," Professor Cross breathed, her equipment registering the subtle vibrations passing through the dome's structure. They're trying to comfort her. The revelation hit the human survivors like a physical blow. These weren't mindless killers waiting to feast on their corpses. These were intelligent beings, perhaps more intelligent than humanity had ever imagined, who had been watching and waiting not for an opportunity to destroy, but for a chance to understand. Marcus Chen, ever practical, voiced what everyone was thinking. If they wanted us dead, we'd be dead already. The dome couldn't stop them if they really wanted in. Then what do they want? Commander Blake demanded. The answer came from an unexpected source. Old Henrik Volkov, the dome's historian, had been quietly reviewing the archives from humanity's final years in the deepest layers of classified data. He found references to something called Project Empathy, a last-ditch attempt to create not just weapons, but beings capable of understanding and preserving human values. "We didn't just make them to fight," Henrik revealed, his voice shaking with the weight of discovery. "We made them to remember, to carry forward what was best about us. Even if we couldn't survive ourselves, the implications were staggering. The apex hunters weren't humanity's executioners, they were its intended inheritors. For 50 years, they had been waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves, to bridge the gap between creator and creation. As if sensing the shift in human understanding, the ancient rose from its kneeling position. It stepped back from the dome and raised its arms in a gesture that needed no translation. An invitation. The dome's emergency systems chose that moment to fail completely. Alarms blared as the structural integrity reached critical failure. The barrier between the two species was about to collapse whether they wanted it to or not. And in that moment of crisis, the apex hunters made their choice. Instead of fleeing or attacking, they moved closer to the dome, their massive bodies forming a living shield around the failing structure. They were trying to protect the humans inside. The dome's collapse came at dawn, structural supports failing. In a cascade of shattering glass and twisted metal, Dr. Elena Voss watched in horror as 50 years of human sanctuary crumbled around them, exposing 3,000 souls to the alien world beyond. But the massacre never came. Instead, the apex hunters formed a protective barrier around the fleeing humans, their massive bodies creating walls of living armor against the debris. The ancient moved with surprising gentleness, using its enormous hands to guide terrified families away from the falling wreckage. "Don't run," little Kira called out, her voice somehow carrying above the chaos. "They're helping us." Commander Blake raised her weapon instinctively as a shadow stalker approached her position, but the creature simply extended its arm, offering to help her carry an injured survivor to safety. The predator's eyes held an intelligence that made Blake's finger freeze on the trigger. Dr. Morrison found himself face to face with a thunder claw, a species he'd studied for years, but never encountered directly. The creature was even more magnificent up close, its bioluminescent markings pulsed with complex patterns that seemed almost like written language across its hide. "You're beautiful," Morrison whispered, the words escaping before he could stop them. The thunder claw tilted its head, and Morrison could swear he saw something like surprise in its expression. Then it made a sound, not a roar or growl, but something almost like a purr of acknowledgement. Professor Cross worked frantically to establish real communication, her portable translation equipment strapped to her back as she moved through the crowd of humans and apex hunters. The patterns were becoming clearer now that she could observe the creatures' body language. Alongside their vocalizations, "They're asking if we're hurt," she announced, her voice filled with wonder. "They want to know if we need help." The evacuation became a strange dance of cooperation. Apex hunters, who had been designed as ultimate predators, carefully lifted human children to safety, their retractable claws sheathed to avoid causing accidental harm. They communicated through a combination of vocalizations, gestures, and the bioluminescent displays on their skin. Engineer Liu Wei found himself working alongside a pair of saber spines to clear a path through the wreckage. The creature's natural strength made quick work of debris that would have taken human crews hours to move. They worked with an efficiency that suggested they understood construction and engineering principles, knowledge that should have been impossible for beings created as weapons. "How do they know how to do this?" Liu asked Professor Cross during a brief rest. "Maybe they've been watching us longer than we realized," she replied, "learning from us. Even when we thought we were hiding." The revelation that changed everything came from young Tommy Rodriguez. The boy had been separated from his mother during the evacuation and found himself alone with the ancient. Instead of panicking, he looked up at the massive creature and asked, "Are you lonely?" The ancient's response was immediate and devastating in its simplicity. It knelt down and gently touched the boy's face, then pointed to the ruins of the dome, then to the other apex hunters, then to the scattered humans. The message was clear. They had all been alone, separated by fear and misunderstanding. Rosa Rodriguez arrived moments later, terror and relief warring in her expression. As she saw her son unharmed beside the enormous predator, the ancient made no move to stop her as she ran to embrace Tommy, instead remaining perfectly still until the reunion was complete. "Thank you," Rosa whispered to the creature, the first words of gratitude ever spoken between the species. The ancient's bioluminescent markings flared in response, a cascade of colors that Professor Cross would later identify as the apex hunter, equivalent of a smile dot. As the sun climbed higher, the full scope of the rescue became apparent. Not a single human had been harmed during the dome's collapse. The apex hunters had not only protected the evacuees, but had also worked to save as much equipment and supplies as possible from the wreckage. Dr. Tanaka observed the interactions between human children and the apex hunters with growing amazement. The children showed no fear, instead treating the creatures as new friends to be explored and understood. 8-year-old Alex Chen was teaching a group of shadow stalkers a clapping game, their massive hands moving with surprising delicacy to match the rhythm. "The children are our translators," Dr. Tanaka realized. "They're naturally forming bonds that we adults can't imagine." As evening approached, the ancient made a gesture that Professor Cross interpreted as an invitation. It pointed toward the bioluminescent forest, then back to the humans, then made a sweeping motion that seemed to encompass everything around them. "I think," Professor Cross said slowly, "they're inviting us home." Commander Blake stepped forward, representing the fears and hesitations of her generation. "How do we know we can trust them?" The ancient's response was to do something unprecedented. It removed what appeared to be a weapon from its side, a biomechanical device that pulsed with dangerous energy, and placed it on the ground between them. Then it stepped back, arms spread wide in a gesture of complete vulnerability. One by one, the other apex hunters followed suit, disarming themselves before the humans they had just saved. The message was unmistakable. "We choose to trust you first." ***. 6 months after the dome's collapse, the settlement of New Harmony stood as proof that impossible dreams could become reality. Built jointly by human ingenuity and apex hunter strength, it was neither a human city nor a predator territory, but something entirely new, a place where two species could grow together. Dr. Elena Voss stood on the observation platform of the settlement's central spire, watching human children play alongside young apex hunters in the communal gardens below. The sight never failed to fill her with wonder. Tommy Rodriguez was teaching a juvenile thunderclaw how to tend the tomato plants, while little Kira Nakamura rode on the back of a patient shadow stalker through the pathways. The integration is proceeding faster than anyone anticipated, reported Dr. Morrison, his research now focused on cooperative behavior rather than predatory patterns. The younger generation of both species seems naturally inclined toward collaboration. Professor Cross had made breakthrough after breakthrough in interspecies communication. The apex hunter's language was more complex than any human tongue, incorporating bioluminescent displays, pheromone releases, and subsonic vibrations alongside traditional vocalizations. But more importantly, they had begun developing a hybrid language that both species could use. They're not just learning our words, Professor Cross explained to the mixed crowd of humans and apex hunters gathered for the weekly community meeting. They're creating new concepts that didn't exist in either of our languages separately. The ancient, who had taken the name Keeper of Trust in the hybrid tongue, served as the primary liaison between the species. Its vast intelligence had become clear over the months. It possessed not just advanced cognitive abilities, but also what could only be described as wisdom. "Tell us about the others," Elena asked during one of their evening conversations. "The apex hunters beyond this forest, are they all like you?" Keeper of Trust's bioluminescent markings shifted to patterns that Professor Cross translated as complex emotions, hope mixed with uncertainty. "Not all choose trust. Some remember only anger. Some remember only fear. But some remember love." The revelation that the apex hunters possessed emotional memories from their creation had been one of the most significant discoveries. Deep in their genetic code, the scientists of humanity's final years had embedded not just survival instincts, but also capacity for empathy, curiosity, and even affection. They were meant to be our children, Henrik Volkov had realized, tears streaming down his weathered face. Not just weapons, but inheritors of everything we valued. The settlement faced challenges that would have been unimaginable in the old world. Resource allocation required considering the needs of both bipedal humans and massive predators. Architecture had to accommodate beings of radically different sizes and abilities. Social structures needed to account for two entirely different evolutionary backgrounds. But the solutions emerged naturally from cooperation. Apex hunters could easily reach the canopy-level fruit that fed both species. Humans could operate the delicate equipment needed for manufacturing and medicine. Together, they created a standard of living that surpassed what either species could achieve alone. Maya Patel, now serving as the settlement's first interspecies coordinator, marveled at how quickly prejudices dissolved when survival depended on cooperation. "Fear is learned," she observed, "but so is trust." The children were the bridge between worlds. Human youngsters, who had never known the terror of the old conflicts, played alongside apex hunter cubs who had never been taught to see humans as enemies. They invented games that required both human cleverness and predator strength, created art that combined human creativity with the natural bioluminescence of their friends, and gradually developed a shared culture that belonged to neither species. Alone, Commander Blake, once the most skeptical of the human survivors, found herself training alongside apex hunter warriors in defensive techniques. The predators had much to teach about situational awareness and physical conditioning, while humans contributed tactical planning and technology integration. "I spent 50 years preparing to fight them," Blake confided to Elena one evening. "I never imagined I'd be learning from them instead." As the settlement's first anniversary approached, delegations from other human enclaves began arriving. Some came with weapons and suspicion, unable to believe that peaceful coexistence was possible. Others came with hope, ready to join the grand experiment. The real test came when a pack of hostile apex hunters approached from the Eastern Territories predators, who had rejected Keeper of Trust's message of cooperation and instead chose to see humans as threats to be eliminated. The battle that followed was unlike any in recorded history. Humans and friendly apex hunters fought side by side, each species compensating for the other's weaknesses. Human technology and strategy combined with predator strength and speed created a defensive force that was more than the sum of its parts. When the dust settled and the hostile pack had retreated. Both species had shed blood for each other. The bonds forged in that moment of shared sacrifice went deeper than any treaty or agreement. Standing in the aftermath, surrounded by wounded humans and apex hunters caring for each other without regard for species, Elena finally understood what the creators of Project Empathy had truly intended. They hadn't built weapons that could feel. They had built a bridge between what humanity was and what it could become. Keeper of Trust approached her, its massive form moving with the careful grace that had become familiar. In the hybrid language they all now spoke, it asked the question that would define their future. What shall we build together tomorrow? Elena looked around at the mixed community, human and apex hunter, young and old, survivor and inheritor, and smiled. Everything, she replied. We'll build everything. As the sun set over New Harmony, to species that had once been predator and prey, creator and creation, enemy and ally, worked together to tend the gardens that would feed them all. In the fading light, it was sometimes impossible to tell where one family ended and another began, and in that beautiful uncertainty, both species found their truest home,